From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Colorado is a tough state to be a restaurant manager in right now. Every day seems to bring news that another local favorite is closing, like the Chocolate Cafe, a favorite of Fort Collins resident Ashley Casey.
Chocolate Cafe just had their own environment. Homey, you could tell it was just run by a couple that just loved what they did.
It's expensive to run a restaurant. And for restaurants along Colorado's Front Range, there's one especially thorny issue: employee pay. For the last few years, Colorado's minimum wage has been $14.81 an hour for non-tipped employees, more than double the national minimum wage. And the local minimum wage in cities like Denver and Boulder is even higher than the state's, which many restaurateurs would argue makes it more difficult to stay afloat. KUNC reporter Emma Vandeninde has been covering this story. She's been looking into employee wages, a proposed law that may help restaurant owners, and the community fallout when a favorite local haunt shuts down. She joins us now for more. Emma, welcome.
Hi, Erin. Great to speak with you.
Emma, in the course of your reporting, you came across a fact that I find staggering. It is basically more expensive to run a restaurant in Denver than it is in New York City.
Yeah.
That's really unexpected. How did the state get to this point?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with minimum wage. New York City's minimum wage right now in 2025 is $16.50. Mm-hmm. And in Denver for 2025, it's $18.81. So we're looking at a little bit around like $2 to $3 more in Denver. And so when you're having to pay more for workers, that is so much more of an added cost on businesses. It gets a lot more complicated when you get into the tipped versus non-tipped workers. But overall, workers in Denver make about $2 an hour more than in New York City. I think cities like Denver and Boulder are cities that are pretty progressive in wanting to fight for workers' rights and saying, okay, we want to help support them, give them the wage that they need to live in a high-cost city. But they're currently struggling with so many other costs right now that trying to keep that up is very, very difficult.
Well, and there are a few factors besides wages that make running a restaurant a very costly venture. The cost of food, expensive real estate, for example. How much do industry experts point to employee pay as this driving force behind the overall expense, as opposed to those other factors?
Yeah, I think wages are hard for any business, right? But I think Sonia Riggs from the Colorado Restaurant Association, she said restaurants are dealing with all of these things and it's death by 1,000 cuts. So I don't think it's like pay is like the number one driver. There's so many different things of rent prices going up, food prices going up. I mean, the cost of eggs right now. There's so many different things happening all at the same time. Sonia also said like some restaurants that used to be supportive of the minimum wage have changed course due to the rising costs of other parts of the business. And some restaurants have started to reduce workers to save money. But when that happens, then service is impacted. So all of these things are kind of on this scale of what are you going to cut and what are the lingering implications because of that?
Losing a restaurant hits people a little differently than when another kind of business closes. Emma, you put out a call in a Facebook group asking people to share their memories of their favorite local restaurant that closed. And I want to share one of the audio responses that I think captures how people miss a favorite restaurant when it closes. This is Katie Nelk in Fort Collins, who was pregnant and a week overdue with her son, Otto, who's now almost 9 years old. She was craving a French dip and a spicy pickle.
My husband and I, we went to the Pickle Barrel, which we loved and enjoyed. And I had my sandwich, and of course, I had spicy pickles with it. And I went into labor the next day. And Otto still loves pickles and spicy ones especially.
And we should note that the Pickle Barrel in Fort Collins closed in 2024. Emma, when you put out that call on Facebook, what stands out to you about the response that you got?
I got an overwhelming response, Erin. It was crazy. I found this Fort Collins-based Facebook group and said, hey, like, I'm a reporter for KUNC. Can you share any stories or memories that you have of restaurants that closed, like, in the recent past? And within, like, 48 hours, I received more than 200 responses.
Whoa.
And there were just so many stories about people who went on, like, first dates at a certain restaurant, or people that, like, celebrated their birthday every single year at the same restaurant.
Yeah.
There was one couple that talked about, oh, I met my grandparents, like, every Wednesday at this restaurant, and it was so great to, like, have this, like, standing tradition with them.
Lawmakers at the state capitol are considering a few ideas to make it easier for restaurants to survive. One bill, House Bill 1208, would lower the base pay for workers who receive tips in cities like Denver and Boulder, where the local minimum wage is higher than the state's. There is support for this from restaurant owners and others in the industry. Emma, how do they say this would help?
So this would allow restaurants in Denver and Boulder and other places that have those higher minimum wages, they can essentially withhold more money. So restaurant owners could use that money to pay for so many other areas, you know, like rent, rising food prices, some of the things I mentioned earlier.
Now, many restaurant workers who get minimum wage don't support this. What do they say?
Yes, many restaurant workers are essentially against this. And I should mention before we move on that this bill was amended. This new version now lets local governments decide if tip restaurant workers should be paid a lower minimum wage or not. But in the old writing of this legislation, it would have effectively decreased Denver workers' wages by $4 an hour, because the minimum wage in Denver, $18.81, that's that direct cash wage plus tips, would drop to the state's minimum wage of $14.81. That's thousands of dollars that servers would be losing over the year. And even though it's solving some of the problems within the restaurant industry, servers need that to get by in a high-cost environment like Denver.
Emma, just lastly, you know, it kind of feels like there's this wave of restaurant closures. I'm curious how much of this, though, is a natural cycle.
I think within the restaurant sphere, we see openings and closures all the time. But I think restaurant officials would say that we're in unprecedented times since the pandemic. You know, so many of them relied on loans to get by during the pandemic, and some of those loans have completely gone away. And while that's happening, you know, inflation is happening. Cost of food is increasing. And like Sonia Riggs said, it is death by 1,000 cuts. And so I think what restaurant officials would say is we need to go back to COVID to see we're still digging out of that hole. And it's not this natural cycle of opening and closures. It's dealing with all of these things at once that have compounded since 5 years ago.
KUNC reporter Emma Vanden Einde covered some of the challenges the restaurant industry faces and what happens when a local favorite shuts down. You can read more in our show notes and at KUNC.org. Emma, thanks so much for talking with me.
Yeah, thank you.
If you have thoughts or questions about today's show or past episodes of In The NoCo, drop us a line. Email noco@KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.